Okay, this is my spontaneous review for the book Clark Gable, written by Warren G. Harris. I think it came out in 2002. So it's a book of 384 pages. I have a bit of a flu, so if I'm coughing, I apologize. 384 pages. I read it. I started reading it in July. And I finished in October, which is pretty fast for me. I'm really proud. Um, okay, this book is uh, not very good, I would say. I think it's all right. It's an all right book, but it's not by any means a great book. My biggest problem with it is that I thought it was quite superficial. I think that it covered like I just feel it covered. I would have preferred if it would have covered less ground but gone more in depth. It just sometimes mentions things that are just not important in a biography on Clark Gable. And then in other instances, you just feel that he just rushes through things, and you don't really get much real insight into the whole matter. And I think it's just the problem is just that this person who wrote this book is just not very deep. I think I think that's the main problem. The writing style is it's not like an annoying writing style. It's not hard to read. It's easy to read, but there's no distinctive style to his writing. There's no personality to his writing. I couldn't tell it apart from any other average writer. There's no style to his writing, and there's no personality, which is kind of a shame, considering that this is a book on Clark Gable, who was such a personality. That it just yeah, I wouldn't call it dry, but just not very elegant. It doesn't have no yeah, like I said, no distinctive style. Um, Having said that, I did learn a lot. But I should mention that I didn't know a whole lot about Clark Gable before I read this book. So, I don't know how I would rate this book if I had read another book on him before that. I had a little bit of knowledge about Clark Gable, but really not a lot. I enjoyed the beginning quite a lot, to learn about his childhood, and he coming, growing up pretty poor and having a lot of struggles along his way, and just the way he was, yeah, his childhood years. Those parts were really interesting. But I don't because the writer doesn't really go. The biggest flaw of this book is that you learn about his upbringing, his wives, the women he dated, the movies he made, all these things, but you don't really learn a whole lot about his personality. And that's the whole reason why you read an autobiography, a biography, or an autobiography on somebody famous. At least for me, I want to learn about the person behind those roles. Who was this person? You know, that is really seriously lacking in this book. I can't say I learned a whole lot about Clark Gable, about his personality. Or maybe I should say that because he doesn't never really go in depth. There's conflicting. the impression I got of Clark Gable, like from reading like the first part of the book, was completely different from the Clark Gable I got to know in like in the middle or in the later part. It's just because there's no he doesn't really grasp him as a person, so I can't say I got much of an insight into him in the beginning, because in the beginning it seems as if he's in the beginning Clark Gable comes across, and you can't know whether that's true because this doesn't seem well researched, so you can't really know whether that's true. But in the beginning my impression was that Clark Gable was very didn't have much of a personality. Actually, he was very moldable. He and he had very little. He seemed, I should say, he seemed from what I read in this book. Like I said, I don't know if it's true, but based on this book, he seemed to be a person with very little um, willpower. Although I think when he was 18 years old, he first saw a play and he decided to be an actor. He kind of drifted, and he met this woman who eventually became his wife, an older woman who was an acting coach, and she just molded him. And he actually wasn't that rugged, tough guy. When he was young, he was reading Shakespeare sonnets and he knew them offhand. And although he grew up on a farm partially, he didn't really like the farm life. And also he had a high-pitched voice, which his first wife, over the course of several years, she trained him to talk more manly. So you think, when you read that, you think, wow. And then he comes to Hollywood, and well, that's a little later. Later on, he goes, he starts being a stage actor, and he goes to Broadway. But again, there's a second wife, again, an older woman who shapes him again. It's like he's constantly shaped by people around him, with not much of a distinctive personality by himself. And over the course of his life, there were always women, very domineering women, seemingly, who were very important in the making of Clark Gable. And then when he came to Hollywood, again, that thing, they made him into this He-Man thing. And that was his image, and they sent him out to get riding lessons. He couldn't ride a horse, apparently. So that macho image, you get the feeling that was all kind of fabricated. But then in the middle of a book, or for the rest of the book, he constantly talks about his personality and his strong personality, and his masculinity, and it doesn't talk like that anymore. It doesn't act anymore like that was somehow fabricated, like that was really him. And everybody talks about his masculinity, and they've several directors and women whatever comment on his masculinity and how tough he was and all those things. So it's like which version is it now? Like like it's very conflicting, and that's just because there's no I don't think simply put, I just don't think that this writer had much of an insight into the personality of Clark Gable. Um, and he never goes deeper than we're constantly being told about, that image of that very masculine, rugged type of man. That's it. But there's not much more underneath it. His sensitivity is not mentioned much. And I always really like to read these things because I'm really interested in people's quirks and little, just what made them who they are. So that's the big reason why I read biographies because I want to, yeah, I want to learn about people's quirks and what they were like. So in that department, I didn't. The only thing I learned is that the thing with the voice I found interesting. I was very surprised that he didn't talk like that by nature. Um, and the other thing that was interesting to learn to me was that he had like a cleanliness fetish. He was really obsessed with cleanliness. He always shaved his armpits, and which was pretty unusual, for the time. And he never took baths because it disgusted him. Because to him it was like bathing in all this. Because to him taking a bath was like bathing in dirt, and he just really had like a, yeah, like a cleanliness fetish. He, like, when he built his house would when he, not build his house, but when they moved into their house, their ranch in Encino with Claire Lombard, like he had, and they built a bathroom for the both of them, two separate bathrooms. He couldn't have a bath in there because he wanted to have a shower. Like, he was really obsessed with, yeah, with cleanliness, which is funny, I guess, and interesting because so many people associate him with, yeah, with this macho image. So those things were interesting, but there's not enough of that. It's just not enough. So like I said, it covers a lot of ground. It basically, it goes through all of his films, and he made what, over 60, I think he made like what, somewhat 65 films or even more. And it basically goes through all of his films, and he spoils like every, like there's like he spoils every movie plot. Like, every movie's ending he spoils. I don't mind that because I'm not interested in plot. It doesn't tell me anything about a film. I'm not interested in what a film is about. I'm interested in how a film is told. So that personally didn't bother me at all. But I'm sure that it would bother other people if they knew the ending of all those films. So, like I said before, because it covers so much ground, it seems, but never goes in depth. It jumps around, and it seems scattered, and it often doesn't make sense. I remember at one point he talks about when Gable was older. No, that was after the war. After he served in the World War, he came back, and then he was like, because it was shortly after Carol Lombard died, he was like super skinny, and then on the next page, he's being cast in his next movie, and he mentions that he had to get in shape, and he had to lose some of his weight because he was overweight. Like it's just like he was just too skinny. 2 pages ago he was too skinny, and 2 pages later he's too overweight. It's just it just seems scattered. It doesn't have a whole. It just doesn't have. It doesn't seem centered, which makes sense because it's not. Because it just so rarely goes in depth. So makes sense that it just picks up things but never really tells you much about anything, really. And then something that always bothers me when I read a biography is that when a writer talks about certain things as if he was there himself, just certain things you just cannot know. But certain things where you just wonder how does he know those things the first time. For example, the first time I became aware of that was when he talked about him and Carol Lombard getting acquainted, and the first time they met, they knew each other a little bit before, but the first time they really met was at this event, and they danced together, and then they were dancing, and he talks about the perfume she was wearing and how he got aroused by the fact that he could feel she wasn't wearing any underwear under her dress, and he got a boner. It's like, I'm thinking, how the hell would he know those things? I mean, it's possible that somebody told him those things, but I still, I don't know. There are other moments where, where he recounts an evening where Clark Gable and Carol Lombard are sitting on the porch of their ranch, and they have this intimate conversation. And how does he know what they're talking about? Um, that's a little, I don't know. That just kind of, I found that a little weird, and certain things were just, too much information for me. I don't need to know that Clark Gable got a boner when he danced with Carol Lombard. It's just not. I don't need to know that. I'm not really interested in Clark Gable's boners. But even if I was, I just don't think it's any of my business. I mean, he doesn't do that a whole lot. I don't think he does that too much, but I just still think it's not really important. Um, he does claim that when he started writing this book, um, a lot of people, that knew Clark Gable were still alive, and he had, he got his information directly from these people, and he lists a bunch of famous people that he interviewed over the years. But many of the quotes, or many of the things that these people have said about Clark Gable, are very famous quotes that I have seen on the internet before I read this book. Most of the quotes about Clark Gable that I read in this book, I have already come across on the internet. And like I said before, I'm not an expert on Clark Gable. But they were known to me already. So I never really got the feeling that this was written by somebody who had really, had some insider information, who really knew people who really knew him. I never got that feeling that he had some sort of a, um, yeah, real insight. It's not how this book comes across. It just seems like somebody who's researched Clark Gable. My favorite. Now let's talk a little bit about what I liked about the book. Like I said before, I learned a couple of things. My favorite part by far is the stretch where he meets and gets married and spends his time with Carol Lombard, who died in 1942. And those couple of those years they had together, those years, the way he recounts Gable's time with Carol Lombard are by far the most interesting thing in the book. It's when the book that is generally a little bit bloodless really comes to life. Those parts about Lombard are really, really, I found a joy to read. And it does help that she had a very spunky personality and was a very spirited person. So they were just, and I love Carol Lombard very much. So that, I guess, all helped. But it's not because I love her so much. It's really because he just seemed more invested. And I realized that must have to do with the fact that before he wrote this book, actually decades before, I think in 1972, he wrote a book called Gable and Lombard, or 1974. Sometime in the 70s, he wrote a book called Gable and Lombard about the relationship between Clark Gable and Carol Lombard. And that just really makes sense when you read this book. It just seems like when he wrote that book on their relationship, he must have done a lot of research, and and by doing so must have learned a lot about Clark Gable, so that, a couple of decades later he probably thought, oh, I might as well just write a book on Clark Gable now that I already have all this knowledge on Clark Gable and have done all that research. But it just seems to me that when you read those passages where Carol Lombard is present, it just seems to me like he's more invested in Lombard, and he seems more interested in Carol Lombard than Clark Gable. That's really the only way how I can explain that. Every time she appears, it's just so much more interesting, and it's almost like the book suddenly has more. It's almost like his writing suddenly has more style and is more interesting to read. So it really seems to me like I generally can't really tell whether he really likes Clark Gable that much. I mean, that I liked, that it wasn't. Sometimes you read biographies from people, who either, they write about somebody they just completely idolize. And that's never good, because then they don't tell you enough about the person's flaws. And sometimes people write about somebody they don't like at all. And that's not good either. So that I liked, that it was really neutral in terms of it didn't put him up on a pedestal. It wrote enough about, certain flaws he had. But it didn't trash him either. That I really liked. But at the same time, it's just not a very personal book. I really feel like I got all the information I kind of wanted, but I really feel like I would have to read another Clark Gable book to get a better insight into the person. I mean, I have my own impressions about Clark Gable, but and at the same time, I think this is the highest rated book on Clark Gable there is. So I don't really know, but it's just not a very, I would say, informative, but not very interesting. And he talks a lot about, money and business, the business aspect of it, kind of like how much money Clark Gable made on a specific movie and how much, percentage he had in interest. It's kind of like, the fuck do I care? Especially when you read about, money was, the dollar was totally different back then than it is now. It really doesn't tell you anything. And another thing that really bugged me towards the end of the book was that, when he talked about The Misfits, which was Clark Gable's last movie, that he didn't go, because Clark Gable, although he died just like 2 weeks after this movie was wrapped, he saw some, he saw some of his performance in the film, and both John Huston, the director, and Clark Gable agreed that it was his best work, Gable's best performance, and that movie is just such an important film on so many levels, and it's so different. It was such a different role for Clark Gable, and many film historians, agree that this was his best performance ever. But he just kind of writes that it didn't do well at the box office, and Clark Gable looked old. And Marilyn Monroe was terrible in that film too. They're both old and haggard, and it wasn't a success. That's it. Like, really, that's all you have to say about that film. That's just, yeah, that just again shows that this wasn't written by a very deep nor intelligent person. I don't think that this author is very, very, very smart. I think that's the main problem here. So, but like I said, it was an okay book. I would still recommend it, I guess, to people who want to have get a first impression on Clark Gable, but yeah, I wouldn't call it one of my favorite books. So I hope this was interesting to you to listen to. That was my review. Bye.